And welcome, everyone. My name is Kira Zeidelman. I'm a technical director at NARUC Center for Partnerships and Innovation, the grant-funded technical assistance office for NARUC's membership of state public utility commissions. And I'd like to thank the U.S. Department of Energy, Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management for supporting today's webinar and all of their support to the Subcommittee on Coal and Carbon Innovation, the recently renamed Subcommittee on Coal and Carbon Innovation. Now I'd like to introduce Chair Angie Hatton from the Kentucky Public Service Commission. She's going to be moderating today's webinar, and thank you very much, Commissioner, for moderating. I'll pass it over to you.
My pleasure. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the NARUC Subcommittee on Coal and Carbon Innovation webinar that we are calling What's Ahead for Coal and Carbon Capture. This webinar is possible due to support from the U.S. Department of Energy, NARUC Coal Modernization and Carbon Management Partnership. And we thank the Department of Energy Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management for supporting NARUC's technical assistance activities for state regulators on coal and carbon management topics. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get started with our panelists today. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording and slides will be posted on NARUC's website and emailed to attendees, probably next week. If you have questions, you can enter those in the Q&A box, and we'll get through as many as possible once the presentations have been completed. I'll introduce our webinar panelists, and then I'll have a few questions, and then we'll open it up for any attendees' questions that you put in the Q&A box. So our first panelist, it's my pleasure to introduce Philip Grader. He is a Director of Energy and Environmental Markets at Energy Ventures Analysis. As part of EVA's world-class energy consulting team, Mr. Grader specializes in the integrated analysis of electric power, coal, and environmental markets around the world. Mr. Grader, if you'd like to get started.
Sounds good. Thank you, Commissioner. And yeah, thank you for having me and having me back. It's always great to be part of these informative webinars. And I want to focus today on kind of the state of the energy markets. And to get us started on a little bit lighter foot, I want to start with my favorite musical and kind of go with when Angelica Schuyler would still be alive today. And she would think about some exact truths that she would be thinking about the energy market. Catherine, if we could go to the next slide. I think we would start with one. Okay. Sorry, this is hard. We'll have this in the cover slides actually coming up. But dispatchable power plants are essential to maintain grid reliability during extreme weather events. Truth number two, and this was the topic of the NARUC Winter Policy Meeting. Data center load growth is creating an unprecedented need for power generation over the next few years. And truth number three, and that was not covered as much during the Winter Policy Meeting, but is truly, truly important right now in the short term. Near-term coal plant retirements will likely result in worsening market conditions from what we're currently experiencing. So I want to start with truth number one. Next slide, please. Again, talking about the dispatchable power plants during these extreme weather events. Next slide. We recently completed yet another report, and at this point, we're really doing these annually, where we analyzed the grid operations for all the major power markets in the U.S. During extreme winter events. We started the first report during Winter Storm Uri, and again, that got all the media coverage there. We followed it up with a report on Winter Storm Elliott, and then summer we stopped naming the storms, but the polar vortex in January 2024 over MLK weekend or that week, and now most recently the polar vortex here in January 2025. And on these charts, and again, without going into too much detail, if you just want to focus on the colorful bars that are not blue, those are some of our peak electricity demand days during these most recent winter storms. As you can see, in PJM really experienced its peak electricity demand during the most recent polar vortex. MISO had a top 5 demand day, and the Southeast, again, here we're covering everything from the Southern Company, Duke Energy, and all the Florida's balancing authorities or utilities there. This has really been a absolute stress test for their electric grid during the most recent polar vortex. And so while we traditionally think of summer being the peak electricity demand season, simply because of the demand from air conditioning, what we've really seen over the last few years, because of these extreme cold events, electricity demand is truly peaking now, more often during these winter events than during the summer. So we go to the next slide. To really put this into perspective, we looked at the average operations for the different fuel types. This is again for the Eastern US, so everything except for the Western interconnect. So we really looked at the average operation of these different fuel types during the December 2024 that we kind of saw as like the average operations, and then compared it to the peak demand day of that polar vortex. And as you can see, just from the size of the green bars, coal and natural gas both combined to meet that incremental peak electricity demand. Other dispatchable resource, we consider oil and hydro to some extent as dispatchable, also increase their generation. And then on the other hand, your non-dispatchables or your intermittent solar and wind really are just available for what they can provide at the time. So again, we encourage you to read the report. We're going into much more detail and by region detail really, but dispatchable generation, again, coal and natural gas that can easily ramp up their generation, assuming operational and fuel availability, have really combined again to meet these peak electricity demand times. So on the next slide, for the sake of here we're looking at capacity factors, because again, when you compare these different storms, obviously the total capacity changes. So really just looking at a capacity factor utilization rate. Again, the dark blue bar was your average operation during December 2024, and the other 3 bars, the gray, green, and red respectively, look at the operation or the capacity factors for these different fuel types during the 3 most recent winter storms. And as you can see, yet again, or proving another point, coal and natural gas both were able to increase their utilization rate at a moment's notice to meet this peak electricity demand. The same goes for oil. And then when you look at the very far right end of that chart, you can see that solar and wind were effectively the same during all of these storms, because again, they're limited by what nature gives them, and so cannot increase their generation at a moment's notice. On to the next slide. Now we're covering truth number 2, and I think we've talked a lot about this, like I said, during the winter policy meeting, but the load growth that we're currently seeing that is really likely happening over the next just 5 years is truly unprecedented. And so if we go to the next slide, and we're going to go through this step by step, we're looking here at the PJM 10-year summer peak demand forecast. And so I'm starting with their forecast just 5 years ago. Again, this is their 2021 forecast. And you can see after that period of effectively no summer peak demand growth since 2014, that's kind of like what the 2021 forecast really expanded on, with a little bit of low growth. And as we click through this slowly, we'll add the demand forecast by year. And as you can see, the curve is truly starting to creep up a little bit. In 2024 is when we saw the first real growth from this data center demand growth. And now their latest demand forecast is absolutely staggering compared to where we are now. Again, we're adding almost 60 gigawatts of demand in this forecast, or 50, I should say, by 2032, or by 2035, that's 60 gigawatts. So over just 10 years, we're adding almost 50% or 30% of our current demand to the summer peak. And the winter peak demand curve looks very, very similar to that. And this is not just the PJM issue. Again, if you just Google data center load growth, and you'll see headlines from all the utilities all across the country. And on the next slide, I'm just wanted to highlight this again. This is our electricity demand forecast for the lower 48 through 2030. And as you can see, the gray part is really, that was our total electricity demand for the year for the previous 10 years from 2010 to 2020, with actually just slightly declining electricity demand, really. And then after 2020 is when we started to see demand pick up. And now over the next 5 years, we're forecasting a 2.5% annual growth in electricity demand across the country. So again, this is not just a PJM issue, but this is really an issue across the country. And then going on the next slide, covering truth number 3, near-term coal retirements will likely result in worsening market conditions. On the next slide, I'm showing the announced and planned coal retirements that happened since 2010, and then what is forecast, or like what's announced and planned for just over the next 5 years through 2030. And while we're a little bit in a lull right now, we're truly seeing a massive amount of coal retirements happening at the end of 2027 or early 2028 and into or by December 31st, 2028. To put that into perspective, the numbers in 28 and 29 are higher than what we saw that was forced with the mercury and air toxic standards compliance deadline in 2015 and 2016. Again, over almost 60 gigawatts of coal retirements are announced by 2030. That's a third of the current operating coal fleet, to just put that into perspective. And then on the next slide, we're looking at what are we replacing these dispatchable resources with, and but more than really any other resource, it's solar. If you look at recent map of completed power generation, it's almost exclusively solar, with some wind and obviously batteries in that equation as well. So we added 30 gigawatts in 2024 alone, and we're forecasting that annual growth rate to actually expand, even with the current administration in place, as long as the tax credit through the IRA are still in place. Solar is really the resource that we're forecasting will provide a lot of this incremental generating capacity over the next 5 years. Now, when we go to the next slide, and the reason why I focused in the beginning on that, we're starting to see power demand really peaking in these winter storms instead of the summer. This is really starting to create an issue for these markets, because all the solar generation during these peak demand hours, during these winter storms, solar is virtually non-existent, because unlike in the summer, when again electricity demand peaks when it's the hottest during the day and the early or to mid-afternoon, early evening, when you still have some solar generation available. In the winter, peak demand is when it's the coldest, and that's usually right before sunrise or right around sunrise. So solar generation, as you can see here, this is the electricity demand for PJM during their peak three peak demand days of the most recent polar vortex, and combining that with its solar generation during the same time period. You can see during those peak hours, solar was either not available at all or available at very low capacity factors or utilization rates. And so even though we're adding a massive amount of solar, we can really rely on that capacity to provide electricity during these peak demand periods. So that is really creating a massive issue. We then move on to the next slide, and John Moore of NARUC actually covered this quite a bit during the winter policy meeting, in their most recent long-term resource assessment, where they really look at the demand forecast for these different power market regions and what their capacity mix or their resource mix is going to look like or change over the next 5 to 10 years compared with the electricity demand. They make an assessment as to which regions are likely at risk of prolonged power outages. And ideally, this map would be all blue. All like blue would mean normal risk, no additional any issues there. But as you can see, a lot of the power market, and MISO especially right now, are in this high risk of possibly electricity shortfalls or power outages during normal peak conditions. And that was echoed by one of the MISO representatives during the policy meeting, that they're really in a reliability issue or could have concerns about reliability right now. Now, what is happening? So we talked about these coal retirements and that they're happening over the next 3 years, or at least they're planned for. So if we move to the next slide, I kind of want to cover a little bit. There's been some announcement from the current administration about kind of trying to roll back some of the regulatory or some of these environmental regulations that are affecting the coal industry. And I try to summarize this at a very high level. What they have announced was primarily about environmental regulations that were passed or that were put into place through the Biden administration and are really affecting the coal industry in the late 2020s or like in the short term, but mostly in the 2030s. So that's your EPA greenhouse gas rule. That's your new 2024 effluent limitation guidelines. It's your MATS rule, some of the revisions there, and the CCR legacy ash rules. Now, all of that is great for possibly delaying coal retirements in the 2030s. But what's forcing these retirements over the next 3 years are what I would consider old environmental regulations actually put into place by the Obama administration that are, so far, I've not heard any announcement about reconsidering the deadlines included in those rules. And so that's the 2020 effluent limitation guidelines and the 2020 coal combustion residual rules. Under Trump 1.0, the administration added retirement subcategories to those rules that allowed effectively the effective coal plants to forego compliance investments if they agree to retire by the end of 2028. With the CCR rule, you need to add a few months to cap the coal combustion residual, like the ash impoundments in place. So that's forcing these end of 2027, early 2028 retirements, and the other retirements are based on the ELG rule. All those compliance deadlines are still in place. And this is really what's forcing these 30 gigawatts of coal, or 50 gigawatts of coal retirements over the next few years. With compliance flexibility really slipping away as time progresses. So this is really the issue number one for the industry. And as you hear about coal retirement delays, a lot of those are just being pushed back to these compliance deadlines that are currently still in effect. So to summarize our 3 truths here, again, the polar vortex here in 2025, just as the previous winter storm, has shown how invaluable dispatchable generation is. Ideally with on-site fuel storage. We didn't see it during the storm, but if we all remember Winter Storm Uri and Winter Storm Elliott, both of which showed that natural gas, if not without fuel storage on site, is truly reliant on there not being any supply disruptions to supply the fuel to those power plants. That's where coal truly shines with multiple days, if not weeks, of on-site fuel storage. Second, the retirements of or the downtrend of fossil fuel generation and the replacement with renewable generation, especially solar, does not help, or this will still continue to grow, but it does not help during these extreme winter events. So we truly have to compare apples to apples and look at dispatchable generation or resources, like, for example, battery storage. That would be the comparable resource instead of just pure solar. And last but not least, again, the old environmental regulations, not that are currently being reconsidered, are what are driving these coal retirements in the near term. And so allowing or considering what options are there to either get those plants into compliance or delay these compliance deadlines or some other form is truly essential to maintain the dispatchable generation that we currently have available to us. So with that, these are my prepared remarks, but I'm happy to answer any questions as we go through Q&A. Again, it's a very exciting and interesting time in the markets, and happy to talk about this later. Thank you, Commissioner.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and introduce our next panelist for his remarks, and then we'll come back for my questions and then questions for any of our participants today who are watching. And be sure and think about some questions that you might have and put those in the Q&A box. So our next speaker is Benjamin Decker, who is the Executive Director of the Alliance for Innovation and Infrastructure, specializing in economic, administrative, and legal aspects of American energy, transportation, infrastructure, and innovation. And then also in this bio, I was told that we're to say good luck to his Aggies tonight in March Madness. I don't know that I personally agree with that. I think Kentucky Wildcats are the ones that we should be wishing luck to, but I guess we'll also say good luck to your Aggies, and please take it away.
I think that's the first time I've had a Texas A&M shout out on any professional call. Appreciate that. Thank you everyone for attending, and very happy to be here. I hope we can have productive conversation and Q&A at the end. So as introduced, I'm Benjamin Decker, Executive Director of AII, the Alliance for Innovation and Infrastructure. And AII is the only innovation and infrastructure focused think tank in the United States. So we're nationwide, and our work really centers around studying and encouraging innovation across the infrastructure landscape. And so we take a systemic view of those things, really from end to end. And I'll start simple with our topic here, with carbon capture and related technology, and then hopefully demonstrate how that's way more complicated than it can seem at first blush. But very happy to begin with a recent brief that our organization put out on 45Q. As many of you, I'm sure, are familiar, 45Q is a tax incentive for carbon capture, utilization, and storage technology and practices. And we recently put out a brief really summarizing some of the recent history of that tax incentive and looking at current proposals that Congress is considering, and evaluating what the Trump administration may do to further incentivize or not push further incentives. So if people would like to read that, you can go to aii.org. And the brief is entitled Maximizing the Potential of 45Q. And so we really focus on the history of this tax credit, which is a lot older than a lot of people think. It was started in 2008 under President Bush. And it was really created to incentivize investment in technology that can capture and reduce carbon, particularly in the energy sector, but also elsewhere. And over the years, there's been a number of updates to it. It's been very bipartisan since its origination. That started with bipartisan sponsorship in the House and Senate, but also after President Bush signed it into law, there's been updates from President Trump and President Biden. So this is something that the Trump administration has already weighed in on in the first term. With that in mind, we might expect them to be positive toward carbon capture technology and incentives, but a little bit of the jury is still out on that. We know that this administration is very focused on hydrocarbons and also technology, and this happens to be where those things intersect. But the reason this has come back into our attention is that Senator Barrasso has introduced a bill in the Senate focused on creating parity between qualifying technologies for carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Part of the thinking and focus there is that some types of CCUS technology are receiving a higher credit or are more incentivized despite having maybe more energy use or less efficiency. And so his bill is focused on creating parity so that really there can be competition among technologies that's more performance oriented. We've sort of jumped on from that starting point to look at ways to actually increase and improve the incentive further. One of those is that the tax incentive as it currently exists is really focused on gaseous carbon oxides. And so that makes a ton of sense when you're thinking about, climate change, atmospheric composition, and things like that. But a ton of innovation that has happened in the last few years, the last decade, and certainly over the last 20 years, has happened in spaces of carbon capture that are not gaseous. And so we focus on a few just little examples to illustrate the point. One of those is a recent way to decarbonize natural gas. It's called methane pyrolysis. You can actually break down methane into clean hydrogen and solid carbon that doesn't produce CO2 emissions. And so that would be an example of something we'd love to see 45Q broaden to capture. No pun intended with capturing there, but allowing different forms of carbon to be incentivized for capture. So with that example, you can think of natural gas running to a commercial or industrial facility, and then behind the meter actually being decarbonized pre-combustion. So that gas flows in, is broken down, and then you have clean hydrogen and a solid carbon that can be used for things like asphalt or built into other types of infrastructure and technology like electric vehicles and some of the battery storage technology that we know is needed in this upcoming energy environment that Philip very well teed up. So that's a really brief synopsis. Really what we would like to encourage the Congress and administration to do is broaden its definitions, move beyond simply gaseous oxides. And then we think that parity piece is actually really important for increasing competition, which does bring more market entry into the carbon capture space. And then just moving on from there, the parity idea. Another thing that we've focused on is promoting the utilization of our existing infrastructure and leveraging it for all that it can do. And that can also look like creating parity, to use that word, between things like gas and electric service. Tons of commercial and industrial facilities use gas as a feedstock or an energy source. And there are ways to incentivize carbon capture and improve efficiency that are site specific and even behind the meter. And so those are things that can be led in the private sector by companies doing tons of innovation, entrepreneurs creating new processes, or through public policy incentives. And so just with the idea here of the simple example I put in the brief, decarbonizing natural gas to create hydrogen and solid carbon, that's something that can also be taken at the state or local level, create incentives for that, create parity, if you will, with things like line extensions, stepping up gas quality and pressure, but also improving the outcomes for things that are more external. So it's an energy solution to have the gas go to the facility, but if you can also create byproducts that are valuable, like carbon dioxide, but also solid carbon and other forms, that can actually create more regional economic value that helps promote other infrastructure. And so we think that's something that's really cool. It's an intersection between a lot of those topics. And then the last piece I'll tee up here is no infrastructure solution is happening in a vacuum. There's tons of technical issues, but also policy issues that can constrain or encourage them. When we think about, Philip mentioned the huge expansion in solar, that is going to come with a lot of issues like potentially eminent domain, land use and siting issues, permitting reform needs for things like environmental approvals, obviously transmission and distribution, focus there on transmission lines. Solar can tend to be further away from the consumers who are using it. And so all of those pieces then have their own components of that. So the transmission line needs its own environmental study, permit approvals, and things like that. If not done concurrently, those things can take decades to put together. And so with that energy demand spiking really in the next 10 years, and 10 years being kind of the timeline for even a single transmission line, there's a need for permitting reform, but also concurrent development of a lot of projects. And so that's a space where innovation, not only in the private sector, but in policy can really help. And so what we're seeing is the Trump administration focus on technology, removing some barriers. We do think permitting reform is a component of that, despite it being sort of an evergreen topic around DC in the last several years. Don't know what form it will take, but I think a level of permitting reform not only is necessary, but is going to happen in this next few years. And then really just an emphasis on communication and collaboration between stakeholders. I think in order for those things to happen, there needs to be a ton of communication between utilities, commissioners, consumers, obviously other policymakers, both at the state and federal level. And so, with those pieces in mind, knowing that infrastructure is really a lot of systems connected, we want to see smooth development where parties are talking to each other so they can do concurrent development, leverage existing infrastructure to the extent that they can. Where carbon capture comes in, that's one of those ways that you can actually do that. You can leverage natural gas lines, for instance, to do a form of site-specific decarbonization that does capture carbon, has other pro-infrastructure opportunities. And then actually, last point I forgot to mention, one of the focuses of this administration is on infrastructure because you can't do effective carbon capture without the infrastructure to support it. And so carbon dioxide pipelines would be an example of that. You actually have to have a conveyance to move the CO2 if that's what the product is. And so that, again, it comes in with permitting reform and things like that. But infrastructure, I think Secretary Chris Wright said this recently, infrastructure can't be the holdup or the choke point for a lot of the solutions that we need. So there will need to be things built out, but we can also leverage what we have toward a lot greater end than we currently are. And I will leave that there and let folks ask some questions. If I can't answer them on this call, I'd be happy to direct you after the fact to more of my technically proficient staff, board of directors, advisors, and so forth at aii.org.
All right, thanks very much, Benjamin. Okay, so I'll start out with a question for both of you. Either of you can jump in first. The Energy Information Administration projects 8.1 gigawatts of coal retirements this year. What can state regulators like myself do to understand the localized impacts of these retirements and ensure that adequate new generation is being brought online?
I guess I'll start since that's related to what I talked about earlier. But first of all, I think the number is getting smaller and smaller. As I mentioned earlier, we are seeing more and more retirement delays, especially for the coal plants right now in the MISO power market. I showed the map earlier, and that NERC LTRA came out in December, and I think since then we've already had 2 gigawatts of coal retirement delays that were scheduled to close by the end of the year. Part of that was actually because of the LTRA. These companies use that as a justification to delay those retirements. Now, as I mentioned before, again, a lot of these retirements that are happening this year are not forced by any particular environmental regulations, if you so will. So I think there's a lot of flexibility, at least in the near term, or at least for this year. You asked about this year. to really consider are these retirements, if they're happening, do we not sacrifice reliability for that? Again, one of your key points always for every utility commissioner across the country is reliability at the very first point, right? And then affordability second. Again, I think everyone that consumes electricity is happy to spend $10 more if that means the lights stay on 24/7. I don't think anyone would like to save $10, but be okay with not having electricity when they truly need it the most. So again, for the short term, everyone across the country is reconsidering these retirements that were, again, announced during times of no load growth in the forecast. Again, most of these retirements have been on the books for 5+ years. And if we just go back to, as I showed in the PJM forecast, if we just go back to 2020 and 2021, when these rules originally came out and these utilities had to make a decision, do we submit our coal plants to these retirement subcategories that the first Trump administration introduced for these environmental regulations? We had no load growth, and power prices were falling. Coal and natural gas were being squeezed by incremental renewable generation, and with no load growth, that came out of the generation share from coal and natural gas. And now we're in a very different situation where we heard the data center folks at the winter policy meeting talk about they need all the generation they can get, and it's a matter of national security. And if that's truly the point, then we really need to consider, and as Ben talked about infrastructure and what Secretary Wright was talking about, because of the time it now takes to put new transmission line into place and the supply chain chokeholds that we have on new transformers or building out switch yards, etc. We really have to consider every single generating resource retirement that is happening over the next few years, and truly, look at it on an individual basis to see if that's absolutely necessary and what can be done to possibly extend those just a little while further to give the industry more time to put new or other generating resource into place.
Okay, would you like to weigh in on that one, Benjamin, as far as what state regulators could do?
Yeah, I think Philip did a great answer with relation to coal and a lot of those other points. I would only add, communication with stakeholders is just super important. I think just understanding what the needs of the region are and what the opportunities are is important. This is a high level point, so there's nothing super insightful here, but incentivizing solutions that can promote efficiency locally is important. Things that can take demand off the grid, if that's more reliance on gas for things, if that's not incentivizing solutions that require a lot more electricity. I know there's different ways to produce hydrogen, which I only use because it's an example from the 45Q brief. If there's ways to do that are regional, that aren't at a hub, those would be opportunities to investigate to still achieve the hydrogen that your region might want, but not call for new electricity demand, such as a green hydrogen hub type of solution. But really, it's just focus on communication, collaboration with all the stakeholders that you can, understand what those needs are, and focus on innovation where you can.
Okay, so I'll switch to a question for Philip. Can you talk to us some more about the use of reliability must-run agreements for coal plants that might otherwise retire?
Okay, sure. So again, reliability must-runs are primarily in independent system operator power markets. We've seen them primarily in PJM for plants where PJM went through its reliability assessment, and we were looking at transmission capabilities and what it would do to the local power grid within the specific PJM zone or load area, that the plants that are scheduled for deactivation, what it would do to reliability. And most prominently, PJM put Indian River coal plant in the Delaware Peninsula under must-run agreement. because it didn't have the transmission capability to allow for more outside the dam of our PJM zone for more power to flow into the region. And actually, that ARM, or Reliability Must Run Agreement, was supposed to run through, I believe, 2026. And they actually were able to get those transmission capabilities into place ahead of schedule. And the Indian River Power Plant actually retired last month, so at the end of February in 2025. However, the other two that PJM put under ARM are the Wagner and the Brandon Shores power plants in Maryland for similar reasons. BG&E, or the BG&E power zone within PJM, is notoriously for having, again, high load or high demand. That's the Baltimore area, with some limited transmission capabilities. And these power plants are situated around the Baltimore harbor. And so Talon Energy said they're going to retire these plants because of economic reasons. And PJM said, not so fast. We do not have the transmission capabilities. And so we kind of need you to run at least through 2029. So to give us time to get the transmission into place. And I think this is echoing what I said earlier. Again, in both of those situations, the issue was infrastructure, the transmission infrastructure. And this is really something that we have seen really over the last 10 plus years. Again, Benjamin talked about eminent domain. Again, that's true for carbon pipelines, natural gas pipelines, transmission lines. It is so hard. Even though everyone wants green and renewable energy, no one wants the transmission lines in their backyard, right? The NIMBYs are very adamant about not wanting to look at wind turbines or solar panels or transmission lines, yet we want the renewable generation. So, and again, that goes back to my other point, right? Is like, if we have such an issue getting the infrastructure in place, then we should really look at the existing infrastructure and assess, once again, is it in the best interest of the power grid and of all the stakeholders to close these power plants, or again, give us more time to get the new infrastructure into place.
Yeah. So you mentioned NIMBY, the not in my backyard. I heard someone recently talk about banana build absolutely nothing at any time, not ever. Or I think I got it just a little bit wrong, but I mean that's some of the things that we're seeing as regulators and as folks like you who study this. Actually, Benjamin Phillip proposed a question to you along those lines. He was asking, what part of the carbon capture, utilization, and storage supply chain do you see as the most difficult, as in having the most barriers, capture, transportation, or injection? And what about those NIMBY objections to the CO2 pipeline?
Yeah, I think anything I say I could defend, but then somebody else would have a really great point about the other ones being more difficult. I'll take transportation as an example, though. Like we've said, infrastructure is what facilitates carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Like it facilitates everything else we do, going to the grocery, turning on our lights, drinking water from our faucet. Infrastructure is really behind the scenes doing everything. And so I would say that is because we need new infrastructure to facilitate new CCUS growth. That would probably be where I would say is the biggest challenge. But only in that context of it's really hard to build new things. There's a huge hurdle to overcome to do it. It's not impossible. And we can utilize existing infrastructure for a lot of those ends. But I think the not in my backyard concept is really difficult because a lot of it begins with misunderstanding of the factors. I think a lot of people push back against CO2 pipelines, for instance, because they think they're unregulated or untested. That's something we've been doing for decades in this country. They're regulated by PHMSA, and so it's safe. Carbon dioxide is not a dangerous. I mean, it might be technically within the under PHMSA, the Hazardous Material Agency, but it's rare that incidents occur at all. And so I think a lot of it is people saying they don't want that in their community because it's unsafe. I mean, when was the last time you saw a pipeline? They exist underground. So it's really not a factor of it being ugly or an issue in your area. It's a quick thing if there's no opposition to do the build, put it in the ground, cover it up, and then go back to normal operations in your community. They're safe, they're reliable, and that goes for all pipelines. I mean, natural gas, oil pipelines, huge safety record, 99.999% of material moved end to end without incident. And so I think a lot of it is misunderstanding. A lot of that might be well-intentioned. They just don't want their community to be unsafe or things like that. But I think when people realize that these are already regulated, they're proven, they've been happening for decades, and every year, new innovative technology makes things safer and more efficient. Certainly the pipelines that we use today are much more sophisticated. The pressure sensors and leak detection and all those types of things, way more sophisticated than even 20 years ago. And those are issues that people who are having the not in my backyard type of mentality should know. And then if they still don't want it in their backyard, at least they have other reasons. And so that would be my starting point.
Okay, so I think I'll have time for at least another question for either of you, and then for each of you, and then we'll get on to some audience questions. I think I'm being told that the chair of our committee, Chair Throne, has a question, so I definitely don't want to miss that opportunity. So Philip, where do you see the grid as being the most vulnerable to a generation shortfall, particularly as many regions, like some utilities in Kentucky, move from a summer peak to a winter peak?
Most vulnerable in what sense? As in like what region, like geographic region or time or
Yeah, geographically, as I know your group studies the extreme weather events, and if there is a geographic area that is most vulnerable.
Okay. Yeah,
Like
I think right. I think it just really echoes like what I said in my prepared remarks. Again, I think the NERC map, the LTRA map really shows that very nicely. And with those retirements happening in MISO, and the low growth that we're seeing there, and the replacement with solar generation, that those are really the immediate areas. And this year we're seeing that in PJM. Again, the latest PJM auction, right, last year set record capacity prices because PJM for one adjusted how they're accounting for solar and wind, and also natural gas and fossil fuel generation. They went, and giving kudos to them, they went back and looked at how these different fuel types performed during Winter Storm Elliott and realized that the demand pull on natural gas during those winter times is a very different situation than during the summer, right? During the summer, air conditioning across the country relies on electricity. Very few plants are on natural gas or some other fuel. And so at the same time, so the natural gas that's available during the summer can be consumed in the power sector because it's needed there to fuel those air conditioning units across the region. However, in the winter, we do have a very significant amount of natural gas being consumed in the residential and commercial sectors for heating during those same events, right? And Commissioner, as you know, like those sectors have priority for deliverability during these times, and the power sector generally is at the tail end of that. And so we've seen that during Uri, we've seen that during Elliott, assuming all the pipelines are working as intended. But the natural gas supply that's available goes to those sectors first. And so you can't, unless like you have some contractual obligations and everything that you can put into place, or like Dominion is talking about for their Chesterfield Energy Center that they're proposing of building, adding liquefied natural gas as on-site storage to kind of gap that or protect themselves against possible reliability issues along the natural gas supply chain. So yeah, to answer your questions, again, we're seeing those reliability issues now, and again, winter is becoming more and more of an issue to reliability than the summer has been in the past.
And now switching to Benjamin, Kira shared in the chat the 405Q brief. Beyond just 405Q, how might changes to IRA tax credits impact load growth and the need for added generation?
It's good question. And I would invite Phil to add on to anything I say here. I think the jury is out on what changes are going to happen with that. Obviously, Congress, the makeup of Congress is a little different from when the IRA was passed. Obviously, the president's different, but Congress writes those bills. I think there's a lot of things in the IRA that are going to get extended. So part of my thought is that there's not necessarily a huge risk. I don't think Congress has an appetite right this minute for cutting a ton of things that a lot of people are relying on. I think we've seen that in other contexts just in the last few weeks. And so part of my answer would be to say, I don't know that there's going to be a giant disruption from that. You did have a second part to your question, though, which I'm now forgetting.
Just how might changes to IRA tax credits impact load growth and the need for added generation?
Yeah. Obviously, it's not going to change the need for the added generation. I mean, that's a background condition. I think we might see slightly different proportions of, renewable build out versus hydrocarbon things. If the incentives are varied. Without thinking more on this topic, I'd love to pitch it to Philip for his thoughts, and then maybe think about that offline and post a blog about it or something.
And I think what we've seen just over the years and decades, really, where we've had like some form of like tax credits. Again, the PTC and ITC, or they're now called clean energy credits, have been around for 15 years almost, right? So they've been around a very long time, and it's always. I think Congress has always been hesitant to remove subsidies, and they're more inclined to add new subsidies to maybe other industries, or let things expire. But again, when you look at a map of where these solar billouts have been, they've been truly across the entire country, right? Red states, blue states, really doesn't matter. And so everyone has been reaping the benefits of that build out and has continued to do so. Again, this is not politically concentrated one way or the other. So I think, as I would echo Ben's point there, that I don't think the political appetite might really be there to materially change what's currently on the books, but we've heard whispers and rumors about trying to find ways to maybe create subsidies for dispatchable generation that maybe provide some financial incentive or subsidy to help them overcome maybe these compliance hurdles and like the financial investments to get those power plants into compliance. So what we see that rather happening than rolling back what's currently on the books.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
I would add one quick thought. It's worth noting that if permitting reform and things like that happen, they can also change the costs and associated projections for things like solar build out. So not that that's a subsidy, but can have the effect of making things more inexpensive to build out.
Okay, so we've got 5 minutes left. This has gone quickly. Great discussion. I want to make sure that we get to Chair Throne's question. Kira, if you want to.
Sure. So as Chair Throne put in the chat from the Wyoming Commission, Philip, going back to your list of items that were being reviewed by the new administration, she mentioned the Clean Air Act endangerment finding for greenhouse gas emissions. What are the realistic prospects for changing the finding? And if it remains in effect, how does that affect the future of coal?
Okay, right. I just focused on the actual environmental regulations that are being reviewed. Yes, there's a lot of other things that are being reconsidered. Social cost of carbon is a very big one that, again, the first administration already did the first time and are now reconsidering because that truly impacts their cost benefit analysis. But really underlying everything, as Chair Thorne says correctly, is the endangerment finding from 2008, 2009, I believe. So back then, again, this was just a finding that CO2 is a critical, or should be a critical air pollutant, and is endangering public safety, and so therefore should be controlled by the EPA as a critical emission. Now, and that has been the underlying foundation, or the requirement for the EPA to do something in terms of CO2 emissions. And so that was the underlying basis for the Clean Power Plan, for the Affordable Clean Energy Rule under the first Trump administration, and now the EPA Greenhouse Gas Rule. So obviously getting rid of that, and again, that's why this is always the focus, would alleviate any requirement from the EPA to do something about CO2. If that rule were to continue to stand, the EPA would have to do something about CO2. And again, flexibility there is questionable. Again, we've seen the very limited inside the fence that the Affordable Clean Energy Rule at the time tried to do. Again, I'm not a legal expert per se, but again, EPA would have to do something. But the endangerment finding has been held up I believe by the Supreme Court and by the Court of Appeals many times since then, that I believe it's very difficult to get rid of the endangerment finding at this point. But I don't know if Ben has additional points on that. Since that's.
Did you want to add, Benjamin? I know we are about out of time. You're on mute.
It'll definitely be interesting to watch, and it'll take a few years at the fastest to do anything, because it would go through the courts, I'm sure. Other than that, no additional insights.
Well, thank you so much, Chair Throne, for the excellent question, and thank you so much to both of my panelists. I think we could easily talk another hour, and I've really enjoyed it. I hope the audience has as well. Please note that the DOE NARUC Coal Modernization and Carbon Management Partnership is offering a tour when MACRUC meets in beautiful Louisville, Kentucky, of Louisville LG&E's Mill Creek Generating Station at the Mid-Atlantic, well, I already said at MACRUC. And our annual meeting is June 25th. The tour is open to all state utility commissioners as well as staff. You can sign up today, and I'd urge you to do so if you haven't already made your plans to come to Louisville. There may be bourbon. There's definitely a meeting at Churchill Downs and a reception there, and lots of fun to be had and lots of great discussion. If you have any questions about that tour, contact Catherine Klein at NARUC. And also, NARUC is now accepting submissions for panel ideas for our summer conference in Boston. That's going to be July 27th through 30th, and we're accepting submissions through April 9th. We'll be sharing presentations from this webinar via email with all attendees today. And again, the recording will be uploaded to NARUC's YouTube channel. You can check NARUC's website for information on other upcoming activities, and please reach out to Catherine or Kira at NARUC if you have any questions or feedback. We are out of time. Thank you so very much for joining us today.